Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you to all of you here, to Barb and to Mark, and to the entire community of St. Peter. I had dinner with some of your fellow members earlier this evening, and I mentioned that the only other church I've given a talk at related to this book was a Unitarian congregation, and you'll be right at home here. So that's good to know. I'm truly very grateful to have an opportunity to speak about this book here. I think it's important that people with religious sensibilities think about inequality. Some do, others don't. I think the more people with religious sensibilities think about inequality, the more they'll see it connected to important issues in their respective faith traditions. So I'm going to talk about my book tonight. The book is longish, and it covers a wide historical range, starting with the ancient Greeks. I have a chapter on Plato, and it goes up to the 19th century with a chapter on Karl Marx. I won't have time to talk about all of them tonight, so I'm going to restrict myself mostly to focusing on Plato and Jesus here. I think that's good for various reasons. Plato and Jesus give us a lot to think about with regards to inequality. So, but I'm happy to answer questions if you want to know what happened to inequality after, say, Jesus. So feel free to open up during questions regarding the larger and longer history of inequality. So I thought I'd start out with just a few data points in case you haven't been reading the papers lately. You might have, maybe some of you have seen the news that Elon Musk was just crowned the first trillionaire in world history. Some people have cranked the numbers on this. What does this mean? One news source figured out that if you stacked up $100 bills to amount to $1 trillion, that stack of $100 bills would be 629 miles high. Another way to think about it, I'm a native New Yorker. I'm very happy about the Knicks. Sorry about the Cavs. You won more recently than we have. It's been a long time. But the Knicks point guard, Jalen Brunson, earns $39 million a year. It seems like a lot of money. For him to earn $1 trillion at that salary, it would take him 25,000 years. It's a long career. If you are an astrophysicist working at SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, the average salary there is $186,000 a year. Sounds like pretty good money. To earn $1 trillion at that salary, working for Elon Musk, you would have to work for 5 million years. $1 trillion, we should note, is 3% of the gross domestic product of the United States. And $1 trillion is also 5 million times the wealth of the average American household. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the economic spectrum, according to a recent study, 37% of Americans would struggle with an unanticipated $400 car repair bill. 13% of them said they would never be able to afford that. The others said maybe if I could borrow money from 4 or 5 different friends I could cobble together $400. Now, this is not a new problem, although it feels new in some respects, and it is new in one important respect, right? Because if you're old enough to remember the days before Ronald Reagan, this is roughly the years from 1940 to 1980. This is a period what economists have called the Great Compression, right? First there was the Great Depression, and then economists say there was a Great Compression, right? This is a period in which inequality was significantly reduced through a variety of measures, most prominently a 91% income tax on the wealthiest Americans, right? Obviously this changed with Ronald Reagan, and inequality has picked up the pace since then. But historians tell us that this is almost to be expected. Walter Scheidel is an historian at Stanford University, and he argues that inequality is in fact the historical norm. This is where the economies tend to gravitate to. And he's wrote an excellent book about this called The Great Leveler, in which he says there's a few things that can fix this. Most of these things you don't actually want, like Ebola could fix this. Widespread, the Black Death did in fact reduce inequality. Great wars, state collapses, and revolutions all tend to reduce inequality, right? And in fact, Scheidel argues that it was World War II and the immense mobilization required for fighting this war that compelled America to raise taxes on the rich, which brought about the Great Compression I talked about earlier. As I mentioned, my book traces the development of inequality, but very specifically it traces how people have thought about inequality. Right? So I focus on 7 figures in this book. I've already mentioned the first 2, Plato and Jesus. There are also chapters on other notable philosophers. This includes Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx. And while I'm not going to talk about all of these folks, I'll give you one of the punchlines of this book right now, which is that these thinkers are very different in terms of what their goals are, right? Let me talk about this a little bit, right? Plato wants to create social harmony. Jesus wants to promote love of God, love of neighbor. Thomas Hobbes wants peace. Rousseau prioritizes something he calls the general will. Adam Smith wants mutual sympathy. John Stuart Mill wants to promote utility. And Karl Marx wants to provide freedom from domination. Right? These are all different agendas, different principles that animate their thinking about theology and politics. But the striking thing that came through as I was researching this book is that almost regardless of what principles philosophers seem to embrace, inequality causes real problems. So I talk about this in the book. I'll be talking about this tonight with these 2 cases, Plato and Jesus. But a couple more points before I turn first to Plato. One is that we used to know this. That is, it used to be more broadly known that the history of philosophy, the history of political thinking, all kind of came to this conclusion, right? It was so well known, in fact, even in the 19th century in America, that the famous former slave and orator Frederick Douglass knew this. Frederick Douglass wrote about inequality and economic inequality, and of course, in addition to slavery, and thought that economic equality was just as important as freedom from chattel slavery. And when Frederick Douglass writes about this, he specifically references the writings of Plutarch. I'll talk a little bit more about Plutarch in a few minutes, but I start my book talking about Plutarch. He's an ancient historian who recorded the histories of ancient Rome and Greece. Frederick Douglass read Plutarch and was inspired by his accounts of ancient Athens and ancient Sparta. And he says, referencing the ancient Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus, he says that Lycurgus was fully justified in the extreme measures he adopted in responding to inequality, including in his confiscation and equal redistribution of all private wealth to secure his citizens' liberties. Drawing on his knowledge of this tradition within Western thought, Douglass observed, quote, "Wherever the palaces tower highest and enclose within their walls the greatest accumulations of luxury and wealth, there does the peasant grovel lowest in ignorance and misery. There is tyranny most secure and freedom most hopeless." Right? So this is Frederick Douglass, right? A man who never had a chance for traditional schooling. He knew about this tradition of thinking about inequality and connected American circumstances in the 19th century to this ancient Greek tradition. So I want to note that. One other thing I want to note before I get to Plato is that in many ways, the arguments I give today are responding to a doctrine of some economists known as sufficientarianism. It's a long word. It's a winning word in Scrabble, if you can work it in. Sufficientarianism. It's a group of economists who argue that while it's right to be concerned about poverty, we shouldn't concern ourselves with Elon Musk's trillions, right? That he has $1 trillion, that's fine, right? As long as, the poorest people have something to eat and a place to sleep. I think that's wrong. And as I talk about Plato and Jesus tonight, you'll see why they think that's wrong as well. All right, so I'm going to start with Plato. Plato, of course, was an ancient Greek philosopher from the city of Athens, active plus or minus 30 years, around 400 before the Common Era. And he's a fun person to talk about with regards to inequality because he's not widely known as someone who cared about inequality. If you read, some of you probably had to read Plato in college, right? Probably read about the philosopher kings and so forth, and Plato seems to be a very strong proponent of hierarchy and inequality himself. And he is on politics. This is also one of the interesting things I've discovered in this book. You don't have to be a Democrat, lowercase d, to care about inequality. You can believe that philosophers should rule, right? And still think inequality is a serious political problem. So Plato grew up in ancient Athens. So it's good that we know a little bit about ancient Greek history. These are things that Plato would have known about growing up, and that anybody getting an education in ancient Athens would have known about in this time. So I referenced Plutarch earlier, Plutarch, the author of the lives of the Greeks and Romans that Frederick Douglass read. Well, from Plutarch, we know about the ancient histories of Sparta and Athens, the two most powerful city-states in the ancient Greek world. And if you read Plutarch's account of these ancient cities, what you discover is that both of these cities had enormous crises of economic inequality. Both Sparta and Athens. The crisis in Athens was so bad that debtors were having to sell themselves and their children into slavery to pay off their creditors. All this happened well before Plato was born. So what does Plutarch write about this? It says, well, in both of these cases, both in ancient Sparta and ancient Athens, these crises of inequality caused a moment of recognition that if we do not do something about economic inequality, we're going to have a revolution and violence and death and all the bad things that nobody should want. So in both of these instances, they called in lawgivers, as they were known, people to come in and write new constitutions for their respective cities. Lycurgus, the ancient Spartan lawgiver, most notably, as Frederick Douglass wrote about, confiscated all the land and said, this isn't working. Giving all the land to a few people has just made most people unhappy and angry and embittered. So he confiscated all the land and redistributed it in equal portions to all the citizens of Sparta. He did some other things as well, but this is the big thing. In Athens, when they had their crisis of inequality, they called in the ancient lawgiver Solon, S-O-L-O-N. And Solon responded a little different, maybe a little bit more moderate than Lycurgus, but radical by our standards, certainly. Solon, who was dealing with this, who was in Athens amidst this enormous debtors crisis, canceled all debts. He says, if you owe money, you don't owe money anymore. If someone owes you money, you're not getting it, right? And there were other reforms as well, in addition to this, right? The basic point that Plutarch makes in his telling of the stories of ancient Sparta and Athens was that they had these crises of inequality, but they saw that they could address this with radical economic reforms and, in fact, new constitutions that would ensure much greater equality and greater civic harmony. So this was kind of the deep history of Greece. Plato was born, as I mentioned, around the year 430 BC. And some inequality had crept back into Athens by this time. About 200 years had passed since Solon's reforms. And there was, again, a very wealthy and powerful class and a class of the poor. These were known, respectively, in terms that will be familiar to many of you as the oligarchs and the Democrats. As Plato, in the first 20 years of Plato's life, Athens was fighting a war, coincidentally, against Sparta. This is the Peloponnesian War. Maybe some of you had to read Thucydides in college, too. It was a very long and ugly war. And Athens, which was the richest, the most powerful, the most respected city-state in all of the Mediterranean world, lost this war to Sparta, which was a great shock to the Athenians, most of all. But it turned out that it happened in large part because Athens was fighting a series of civil wars. There were 3 civil wars in Athens as they were fighting an external war against the Spartans. And all of these civil wars were class wars. There was an oligarchic war of the rich against the poor, then a democratic war of the poor against the rich, followed by an oligarchic war of the rich against the poor. This is what happened in the first 20 years of Plato's life. So why did Plato care about inequality? Well, as I argue in the book, it was part of his lived experience. It's what he grew up with, and you couldn't help but to think about this. So, let's talk a little bit about some of the specific things that Plato says, why he thinks specifically inequality is a problem, and what he thought could be done about it. Well, I'm going to talk about this on two dimensions with Plato. Inequality is problematic both for what the ancient Greeks called the soul, but also for larger or external political reasons as well. So we'll start with the soul, and then I'll work my way to the political reasons. So if you read Plato again in college or elsewhere, you might remember that he spends a lot of time talking about the virtues, right? And there are 4 virtues for Plato: wisdom, temperance or moderation, courage, and justice. And he says anybody who's going to have a healthy soul needs to cultivate all of these virtues. What happens when you have extreme inequality? And here, the real emphasis for Plato is on extreme wealth. So we can bring Elon Musk back into this if you want to, put a place marker in your mind as we talk about this. Plato says that all 4 of these virtues become disrupted, right? If you, regarding the virtue of wisdom, for example, right? Well, he says, if you're really rich, you tend to assume that you're wise without having done any of the hard work of becoming so, right? You just assume because the way people treat you, and the people are subservient, right, and catering to you, right, and saying, "Oh yes, sir," a lot, right? You start to hear that a lot. You start to assume, I must be pretty smart. I must be very wise, without putting in for what for Plato is the very important intellectual labor, right, of reading, thinking, engaging in dialogue with other smart people, and cultivating this virtue of wisdom. Okay, second virtue I'll talk about is temperance, or moderation. The Greek word here is sophrozouna, or self-control. So for Plato, if you're a virtuous person, you have temperance, which means for him that the better parts of your soul rules the worst part of your soul. Right? Well, what's the better part of your soul? The reasoning part of your soul, right? The part that contemplates, considers, calculates. Whereas if you were to put your appetites in charge, then you would not have temperance or moderation. And in fact, a deficiency in this particular virtue has a name, has a Greek word, and it's a word that's both in Plato and in the Gospels, and this word is pleonexia. Pleonexia. It's a Greek word, and it means greed, but it's more than just greed. It's insatiable greed. It's the desire for more without any possible satisfaction. Plato gives an example of pleonexia in his dialogue, the Gorgias, and he says, imagine a jug with a leak in it. You can start pouring water into that jug, but at no point will that jug with a hole in it ever be satisfied with the amount of water you pour into it. Right? You can pour the rest of your life more water into this jug and it will keep taking more. And Plato says that certain souls are this way, and these are the pleonectic souls. And he says there are three objects of people's desire that are especially susceptible to pleonexia. And it's not everybody. This is just for people with sick souls, according to him. But these are people who have an insatiable desire for power. Right? They can never have enough. There's no way they could ever be satisfied with the amount of power they have. They always want more. Right? Second thing is adulation. Right? It's not just enough for your spouse to say that he or she loves you. Right? The whole world must love you. And they probably don't love you enough. And you're going to make sure they love you enough, right? But it will never be enough, right? This is the pleonectic soul. Everyone must love you more than anything else in the world. And if you don't have that, you're miserable. The third thing, you can probably guess. What would be the third object of pleonexia? Wealth, exactly, right? Money, right? When I was a kid, my mom had a coffee cup that said, "You can never be too thin or too rich." And I don't know about being too thin. I mean, you can definitely be too thin. But too rich, this is certainly another dimension of pleonexia. And this is the one that seems to concern Plato more than any of the others, right? And he describes these people as having oligarchic souls, right? People who desire money without any possible satiation. So for these people, right, they will do anything. There's nothing they will stop at to try to get more money. There's nobody they won't betray. There's nothing they won't steal. There's no one they won't hurt in order to get more money, right? So Plato says these people are pleonectic, and in fact he says these people are enslaved to their souls, right? It's enslaved, in fact, to their desires. Right? Their reason is not in charge. Their desires are in charge. All right. So inequality is especially bad for the very rich, which is maybe counterintuitive. We don't think of the rich as suffering from inequality, but if you look at it from a certain perspective, for Plato, and this will also be true for Jesus, we should pity these people. They are truly miserable, he says, right? And they put on a good act. They want you to think they're having a great time, but deep in their diseased souls, they are suffering. All right. I don't need to talk about courage and justice so much. Just know that those are also problems for him. So let me then proceed to talk about the political problems introduced by inequality for Plato. And as I start to do this, I want to emphasize, as I do in my book, what is most important to Plato. This is my interpretation of Plato. Other Plato scholars will have other takes on this, I'm sure. But as I read and think about Plato, the single most important thing in his political philosophy is to achieve social harmony. So if you've read Plato, you might have read The Republic. Most people have not read his last dialogue called The Laws, which is also about politics, the way The Republic is. It's much longer, and people say it's more boring. I like it. But if you read this dialogue, the last and longest of all of Plato's dialogues, There are three characters talking, and the question that comes up is a really good question, the one that they debate for many pages, which is, what's the point of the laws? What should be the purpose of a law, right? We have a legislature, theoretically, right? They're supposed to be making laws. What's the point of these laws? Is there an overarching philosophy? Well, through this character of the Athenian stranger in Plato's Laws, Plato says, yes, there's a purpose for the laws, and that purpose is to promote concord and civic harmony, right? The most important thing is to help citizens get along with each other, because if you can't do that, there's nothing else that very good that's going to come from your politics. Plato is, of course, he's talking about a much smaller republic, right? Athens had about 25,000 citizens, right, for comparison. Cleveland's a lot bigger than that, right? So it may be harder in some ways, but we're just dealing with Plato as he discusses these things. He says you have to create some form of friendship among citizens, right? And he provides a very useful way of thinking about this in his Republic. He says, imagine that you are, walking somewhere, in ancient Athens, not everybody had footwear, and you step on a thorn or a nail, right? It sticks right into your foot. Plato asks, do you have the luxury of saying, I guess that's my foot's problem. It's not my problem, right? Of course not, right? Your foot is you, right? And if you step on a thorn or a nail, it is your problem. Well, we need to think of the Republic in similar terms, right? Such that if a particular class or group of citizens are being systematically oppressed, harassed, and harmed, that's not their problem, that's our problem, right? And Plato wants us to think in terms of a radical unity of people, right? Because if we don't do that, then the door is wide open for wide-scale abuses and wars across the classes, which is why Plato says in his Republic, if you have great inequality in a city, you do not even have a city. You have two cities, and two cities at war with one another, right? Of course, again, this was the reality of Plato's youth. This is what he saw growing up, right? He saw a rich group of citizens and a poor group of citizens, and they were literally at war with one another, right? So if we're going to solve this problem, we probably need to rein in the inequality. And this is why in his other dialogue, the Laws, the last and longest dialogue, he describes a city characterized by inequality as suffering from what he calls the greatest of all plagues, which coincidentally is the title of my book. Right? And I should explain this. The greatest of all plagues is not actually inequality for Plato. It is civil war. But for Plato, unchecked inequality inevitably leads to civil war and the greatest of all plagues. Right? So if you do not want that, if you do not want the greatest of all plagues, you must address inequality. So, what does he say we should do? I'll talk about these two dialogues again, the Republic and the Laws. I'll talk more briefly about the Republic, where he's lighter on details, but I'm going to mention one specific detail because it's relevant in the current political environment. In the Republic, one specific mechanism he introduces is that he bans the ruling class from holding any property at all. He says, you want political power? Fine. Hand over all your goods to the state. We'll see how much you really want the power. Because if you're going to hold on to your property, you're going to be inevitably tempted to use your authority to expand your wealth and become, say, Vladimir Putin, or fill in the blank, right? There's plenty of others, right? That is just an impossible human temptation, right? And it says no republic should put its rulers in a position where it could profit from ruling. He also, it's a very compelling argument. It's not an argument that we hear much these days. I mean, it was true, until recently that all presidents, at least, as a matter of tradition, right, and norms, used to at least put their investments in blind, accounts, right, where they didn't know what they had, right? But we don't even do that anymore. And again, you can fill in the blanks. Another thing that Plato teaches in the Republic is it actually ends with a story of the afterlife, interestingly. And he certainly implies there that people who become very rich in this world will suffer in the next. They will be tormented. He's very specific about this. 10 times over for every terrible thing they did in this world. And one of the greatest sins is becoming very rich. I'm going to move on to the laws for the purposes of time, and also because he says more here, and he's more specific and has specifically interesting ideas here. So, in his laws, again, the last and longest of all of his dialogues, he specifically says, in any well-governed republic, the richest citizen would have no more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest. 4 to 1 ratio, right there. And there would be classes in between, right? But anybody who has momentarily more than 4 times the amount of money of the poorest person in the republic must immediately pass that money over to the state, or the state will come in and take it, right? And then repurpose that money to public goods and other things that will benefit the whole community and not just the richest class. This 4 to 1 ratio has particular resonance to me right now, given one of the numbers I cited a few minutes ago, that Elon Musk has 5 million times the wealth of the average American, not the poorest, the average, right? To get some sense of the gap between Plato and us. Plato says that this is the most important objective of the bureaucrats in his republic. They must be monitoring and managing this ratio to keep it from getting out of hand. And he proposes many laws that will help regulate this. Laws regulating things like price gouging. He encourages marriages across economic classes. He wants to regulate fair prices in the economy. There's many laws that he introduces to try to make sure that nobody's wealth gets out of hand. Now, this 4 to 1 ratio, he acknowledges, would be great. It is not easy just to impose that, right? And this is where it runs up against his larger concern of social harmony. Because he says, if I could just wave a magic wand and institute this 4 to 1 policy, I would do it. But the fact is that if you were to institute this rule in places like, say, the United States, where inequality well exceeds 4 to 1, right, you would have a revolution on your hand, right? The oligarchs would start their own revolution, as happened again in ancient Athens, right? So, what do you do about this? Well, he says, you don't just throw up your hands and give up. You have to do something. And what he suggests is this, roughly, that you have to engage in incremental, slow change. And a lot of this begins with education. You need to start shaming excessive wealth, and this needs to be taught to small children. Oh, isn't it embarrassing? Isn't it so silly? This pathetic person has so much money and parades around on stage with a chainsaw. I'm sorry, did I just say that? Isn't that ridiculous, right? And you begin teaching children that it's in fact shameful to be that rich, right? And he says you can even co-opt members of the wealthy class who are themselves embarrassed of their wealth, right? And you might think of certain examples, even in American culture, that might be sympathetic to this. Abigail Disney is a good example, heir to the Disney fortune. And even to a degree, Warren Buffett seems somewhat ashamed of his enormous wealth and ashamed of the fact that he pays less in taxes than his secretary. Get these people involved, right? Make them talk to their friends, right? And begin the slow process of fixing this. All right, well, we're in a religious community here. We should talk a little bit about Jesus. So there's a lot of debate among Christians about whether inequality is a problem or not. But as I start my chapter on Jesus, I think Pope Francis got this pretty much right in his encyclical on inequality and the climate. So, but I want to also hear, when we start talking about Jesus, we need again to know the history, right? One of the big questions that I really spent time thinking about as I was researching this chapter was, why Jesus? There are a lot of people who claim to be the Messiah back in ancient Israel or Roman Palestine, as it's variously called, right? A lot of people claim to be Messiah. Why did Jesus take off as a movement? And there are a lot of theological reasons for that. I'm not a theologian. There are people in this room who know a lot more about this than I do. So I'm not going to engage in the theological reasons. I'm going to talk about the economic reasons why Jesus would have had real popular appeal. And to understand why Jesus had real popular appeal, we have to understand that ancient Israel or Roman Palestine was encumbered with enormous inequality, every bit as much as ancient Sparta and Athens. Jesus, we know, is from Nazareth, right? From the wider region of Galilee. Most people in Galilee were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, right? And on the precipice of starvation much of the time, right? There were rich people in ancient Galilee. Most of them tended to be in the city of Sepphoris, which was walkable from Nazareth, a wealthy city that had gotten a lot of money from Rome. Well, when you have a lot of farmers in particular in a community like Nazareth, farmers were then, as they are now, very subject to the whims of the weather. Droughts were always a concern, especially in the Middle East, as is true today, right? And a serious drought meant extreme poverty, desperate need for money and food. So what did they do? Well, they looked around for money. Now, I should mention, right, the ancient, the Hebrew Bible speaks very much to these people. It says, well, you give to the poor, right? That's as true in the Old Testament as it is in the New, right? But they didn't get that, right? The only option seemed to be to borrow money. And they appealed to the rich. Can you loan us some money? Be better if you gave it to us, but if not, can you loan us money? And the rich said no, because of ancient Jewish law, or two laws, in fact. And these two laws are the sabbatical laws and the Jubilee laws. And all of this all of these laws are in the books of Moses. I'll talk about both of them. The sabbatical laws happen once, as you might imagine, every 7 years, same as a professor's sabbatical, right? And every sabbatical year requires a few things. Among those things is that anyone that you might hold as a slave, you must release on the 7th year. And not just release them, but fill their pockets with money and then release them. The second thing you have to do is forgive all debt, right? That's sabbatical laws. The seventh of every sabbatical years, so once every 49 or 50 years, right, is a Jubilee year. And the Jubilee year requires that we do all the sabbatical things, right, but we also restore all property back to their original distribution according to the books of Moses, again, which is a relatively equitable distribution of property. So, why were these laws a problem? Well, the rich, the potential creditors said, hey, I would love to loan money to the poor, but, look, there's going to be a sabbatical year coming up in a few years. I'm going to have to forgive this money, and it's going to be a loss to me, right? Or, they put up their property as collateral, right? But I'm going to have to give this land back at some point, right? And that's a loss for me, right? So they appealed to the local rabbi. It was Rabbi Hillel, a fairly famous Pharisee rabbi, and, you might have walked by Hillel Center at some point on a university campus. A famous rabbi. They appeal to Rabbi Hillel, and they say, oh, we'd love to help out the poor, but, these rules make it, unwise for me financially. So Rabbi Hillel issues what is known as the prosbul, or the suspension of the sabbatical and Jubilee years. Says these laws now do not apply. Right? And the idea, and I'm going to be charitable to Rabbi Hillel, the idea was, well, this unfreezes credit and allows these starving farmers to eat, which is a goal I think everybody could get behind, right? So, what happens? You can imagine, right? There's a drought, right? And then, people are taken as slaves, right? And their property is confiscated as it had been collateral. And whereas before the prosbul, right, someone who's now a slave can say, well, I'm a slave now, but I'm going to be free in a few years, right? Whatever, I'll get through this and get to the other side of it, right? Now, there's no more sabbatical rule, so there's no chance they'll ever be free again. In addition to that, right, if they had property that was confiscated by their creditors, right, they could have comforted themselves saying, well, I lost my land, but my children or grandchildren will eventually get this plot back and can start over again. Well, with the Jubilee law gone, that's no longer a possibility, right? So we get extreme inequality, a class of creditors and debtors, a class of masters and slaves, right? And we have an enormous dissatisfaction on the part of the poor, as you might imagine, right? This is the world that Jesus enters, right? And if you want to think about Jesus' ministry, right, in this context, all you have to do is think about the Lord's Prayer, right? And think about, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. This is the message that Jesus is delivering to these people who were literally in debt, right? Right. This is a very important historical, economic context. All right. Now, I How long have I been going on? I've been going on for a while, haven't I? I should probably stop here. Let me just make a few final comments here. Talk about how Jesus thought this could be resolved. I've already kind of given this away. Jesus does specifically say in his early ministry in Capernaum that it is the year of the Lord. It is a Jubilee year, right? Jesus literally is saying it's time to forgive your debts and time to give property back to the poor, right? And we should also note Jesus's messages of love of God and love of neighbor, right? If you really love God, you must love your neighbor. And if you really love your neighbor, are you going to oppress them? Are you going to confiscate their money? Are you going to enslave them, right? Or the opposite, right? There's obviously a lot more in there we could talk about, but I do want to leave some time for questions, so maybe I'll stop here for now, and I'll field whatever questions you have.
Thank you. So that everyone can hear the questions as well as the answers, if you have a question, please come up and use our microphone here to pose a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you think that the inequality, economic inequality, has already built into the Constitution?
Yeah, is the microphone on? Okay. Okay. Sure. I can hear you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll repeat the question. She asked, is economic inequality built into the U.S. Constitution? Let me first say that this was a real concern and debate amongst the founders. And some of you might have read the Federalist Papers in college, right? The series of essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, to defend the Constitution as it was written in 1787. There were also anti-federalists who opposed the Constitution. Sometimes we think of these people as the villains, but in fact, many of the anti-federalists expressed precisely this concern. They were deeply concerned that this Constitution would, in fact, cement the power of an oligarchic elite. And I should say, even those there were some among the Federalists who had a similar concern. John Adams, our second president, wrote extensively about the dangers of oligarchy, the dangers of a wealthy class commandeering the U.S. government under the Constitution and making all of us do their bidding. So it was a real concern. Now, James Madison addresses this specifically in Federalist number 10. And he says, inequality is something that's going to happen. He says, because different people are born with different attributes and talents. Some people are going to acquire more property than others. And this will give way to classes, and these classes will tend to conflict with one another and bump heads. His argument is that we can that the constitutional system combats this through federalism, checks and balances, separation of powers, right? The idea is that, the Senate is probably going to be more oligarchic, but the House represents the people. It's supposed to represent the people, including the poor, right? And it was a fairly radically democratic element of the U.S. Constitution at the time that the poor actually could vote in the United States under the Constitution. So there was some hope on the part of the founders that that this problem could be addressed effectively. Now we should note that inequality in this period, and this is a remarkable fact I discovered, inequality in this period, even when we take into consideration the massive population of slaves in the American South, well, not just in the South in that period, right? The massive population of slaves and slave owners were part of the Republic. If we factor them all into it, inequality today is significantly greater than it was over that slave society, right? We have much more inequality now. So in some respects, right, the founders just couldn't imagine that we would have the degree of inequality that we actually have right now. So that might have been a lack of imagination, right? It could just be the inevitable effects of an industrial revolution they didn't see coming, right? Yeah, so they thought about it. They thought about it, the solutions they provided for it may not have been adequate for the circumstances that ultimately, transpired. Oh, yeah, anybody who wants to come up to the mic?
I have two questions about unions.
Yes.
Did they help bring about more equality? And
Yeah.
now that there aren't many unions or union workers, what's the hope? Is there some hope of reviving unions or an alternative?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I should clarify I'm not an expert on unions, but I think I can answer this anyway. Yeah, of course, unions were a big part of establishing more equality. It took a while, we should say, right? And the unions' effect on inequality weren't fully felt until Franklin Roosevelt, really, who protected the rights of unions through various elements of the New Deal. But yes, the unions certainly tamed inequality significantly. And there's no question, right, I mentioned that Ronald Reagan was kind of the turning point with, reducing the top marginal tax rates in promoting more inequality. But Ronald Reagan, one of his first, most famous gestures as president was to fire all the air traffic controllers in the Air Traffic Controllers Union, right? And that was a bow shot across to the unions everywhere that we don't respect your bargaining power anymore, right? And if you get out of your lane, right, and you assert rights and demands that the rich aren't willing to countenance, we can put you on the streets, right? There's no question that unions have declined significantly in a way that very much parallels the growth of inequality. And then your last question: what can we do to maybe promote the interests of unions these days? This is where I'm probably getting outside of my definitely not getting outside my area of expertise, right? But I would, in broad terms, I would argue for grassroots political mobilization, working class people stepping up and demanding these rights in a way that the government can't afford to ignore, right? And this has to do mostly with voting, right? Voting for candidates that are actually seem to be making a commitment to unions and other related issues contributing to inequality. Yes.
Dr. Williams, I'm not sure if this is in your area of expertise, but with our volley into Iran, we have drastically increased our national debt.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that coming to reckon with that national debt will eventually do anything to address inequality in this country?
Yeah. So I'll repeat the question, yeah. The question was, in the context of this very expensive war that either is concluded or not concluded, we're not really sure still, but we know is really expensive. We've contributed significantly to the national debt. How does the national debt affect our thinking about inequality right now? How is that going to affect the larger republic? And here again, I'm going to say it's a little beyond my expertise, but I will take the most extreme answer to this possible, which is an answer that Walter Scheidel would give. I cited him earlier. He's a Stanford historian. Right? I mean, look, if the debt has climbed to such a level, right, that it drives up the prices of everything radically, which it could conceivably do. That's a real danger in having a massive debt, right? It would create extreme inflation, right? We're going to have a state collapse at that point is a legitimate possibility, right? And for Walter Scheidel, state collapse is one of the best things for fixing inequality. It's proven historically that if a state entirely collapses, then we pretty much go back to zero and start over again, right? Now that's maybe not great to contemplate actually going through, right? Nobody wants to live through a state collapse. If you've ever lived in a nation that has collapsed, it's no picnic. It certainly wouldn't be here. But in terms of actually addressing inequality, it would, right? But I should say, Scheidel's argument is that, he calls things like state collapse and pandemics and natural disasters and revolutions, he calls them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. He says they do their job, but they're a mixed blessing as well. They do a lot of damage in the process. So yeah, maybe it would fix it, but I would argue, we'd do better to find other ways to address inequality without the uncertainty and the violence, if at all possible.
Can you speak a little bit more about property rights and wealth? Because so many times communities don't want certain things, or at the expense of the environment, things get built, but
yeah.
do we do it wrong in this country?
Property rights. The question was about property rights. So I have a whole chapter in this book on Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is an English philosopher of the 17th century. And this is a period when property rights are really taking shape, and people are starting to make aggressive claims to property. And this would culminate in Thomas Hobbes' successor, the English philosopher John Locke, who says that we have a few natural rights, and those rights include the rights to life, liberty, and property. Ultimately, that was changed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But original formulation is property. So I'm going to use your question as an excuse to talk about Thomas Hobbes, 17th century English philosopher, where I'm most comfortable talking about old philosophers. So Hobbes is very skeptical about people claiming absolute property rights, interestingly. And his argument actually alludes to the Bible. I talked earlier about the Jubilee laws that required property redistribution, right? And someone might have argued, well, hey, like I paid for this property fairly, I traded for this property, it's my property, right? And the book of Leviticus actually addressed this question directly. And it says, it's not your property. it's God's property, right? You're the steward of the property, right? But God can reclaim this as God sees fit, which is once every 50 years, according to the book of Leviticus, right? Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century revises this a little bit. And he says, well, in addition to the immortal God, there is a mortal God. And this argument has pluses and minuses. I'm not going to pretend it's all good, but it's interesting. The mortal God is the sovereign, right? The government, right? And Hobbes says, nobody, the same as Leviticus says, nobody has an absolute right to property. That property actually belongs to the government. You are the steward of it. And the government can confiscate and redistribute that property as it sees fit, right? And in some cases, this is fairly intuitive, like in cases of eminent domain to build a highway or a city park or whatever. The government can move in and give you money and say, off, we have, we're going to build an airport or whatever, right? Because it's the government, right? But Hobbes also says the most important reason to confiscate property is to take property from people who have too much money because they become a threat to the whole commonwealth, as he calls it. Property rights have been an important part of the discourse of the Western tradition, Western political philosophy, Western law. But there's also a tradition of saying, we might think of property more as stewardship, right, than some kind of absolute right. If we think of it as an absolute right, that lends itself to greater and greater concentrations of wealth, right, such that, you end up with trillionaires eventually, right? So the point of Hobbes is to say, the government has kind of an obligation to step in and take property because it is, after all, the government's property in the first place. So, yes.
So much to think about. Thank you. I haven't read your book.
That's okay.
But I have basically two questions. One that kind of follow up the union question, and one that follows up the private property question. So the first one I want to ask is, before the first Trump administration, there had been a significant beginning of a conversation, a real conversation about reparations
Yeah.
for Americans. And there's some small examples of that. And I'm just wondering, of the philosophers that you write about,
Yeah.
is there someone that could give a classical view on how you repair harm for people who have been, their property or their ability to create wealth has been taken from them? That's the first
Okay.
question. The second question I have is in terms of examples of societies that have been able to fashion less inequality. I'm thinking of Madrigal. 30 years ago, our community was talking about these kind of conversations. We had a Nana Miller who was critiquing that the cooperative model is actually a more progressive
Yeah.
model than a union, which can be politically corrupt and can side with those that are powerful. So I was just wondering if you could give us some thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Okay, so the two questions were, the first was about reparations, and the second was about worker co-ops. So let me talk just a little bit about reparations. It doesn't come up much, I should say, in the chapters of my book, with the one very notable exception of Frederick Douglass, whom I referenced at the outset of my lecture tonight. This was, of course, the principle behind 40 acres and a mule, right? That was proposed by General Sherman near the end of the Civil War, right? That every freed slave should get 40 acres and a mule, right, to have real substantial property and some ability to farm it so they could achieve independence and sustain themselves and build their own futures. Of course, as we know, 40 acres and a mule never came about, right? And the racial inequality was compounded by severe economic inequality, right? So when Frederick Douglass is referencing Lycurgus in this essay that I cited earlier, he's saying that yes, absolutely, Lycurgus was right, and we should be confiscating land, right, from the white oppressors in the South and giving that to the freed slaves, along with the mule, right, to address this historical and profound injustice, right? Now we're, more than a century and a half beyond the Civil War, right? These questions have become trickier and become more involved, right? And people, as came up with the property rights question earlier, right? If we were to attempt this kind of redistribution now, right, there would be a real fight about this, to be sure, right? But for Frederick Douglass, this was a matter of justice, and also, I should say, liberty, right? Because Douglass says that if the freed slaves don't get financial independence, they will always be in a kind of slavery to wealthy white people. So that's reparations. Regarding co-ops, so I do actually write about this in my book. John Stuart Mill is a 19th century British philosopher, and deeply concerned about inequality, but still, although he certainly had socialist dimensions of his thought, and his thought was kind of drifting that way over the course of his career, for much of his career, he was a committed capitalist. And he was thought about, well, how can we fix inequality in the context of capitalism? And one of his major arguments is worker co-ops. He said he thought that worker co-ops were a better model of business than businesses owned by single, individuals, right? For the reason that the workers would take more pride in their work, right, as owners of the business, right? They would do a better job. They would make better objects, right? They would provide better service. Whatever they're doing, right, they're doing it with a sense of ownership and pride, and not out of a sense of, I have to do this because the man, is looking at me, right? Those are two very different attitudes. And he says, in the context of a worker co-op, you should expect better work. And he was optimistic that if the government specifically incentivizes the creation of worker co-ops, consumers would gravitate toward their products for the reputation of providing better products and services. Alas, that never really happened. We see it in small bits, right? If you belong to a credit union, for example, I don't know if you have grocery store co-ops in Cleveland or not, right? But maybe a little bit, right? You have some experience with this, right? There's little bits of it. But yes, John Stuart Mill was a profound advocate of this. He didn't think this would solve all the problems, by the way. Mill also favored close to 100% tax and inheritance tax on fortunes. When people die, whatever they've done to earn that money is over, right? And that money goes back to the pool to be shared by others. Their descendants have no particular rights to that money. And he said that fully committed to the principles of capitalism. Capitalism says you should be rewarded for your work. Well, wealthy heirs have done nothing to earn their wealth. So capitalism doesn't require that they get their money. That's some other principle which he finds to be unpersuasive.
Can anybody hear me now? I don't think so.
No, I can hear you, and I can repeat your question. Okay.
Reference Elon Musk.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah. 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 So I don't know if people heard it. So the point was, $1 trillion doesn't even make any sense. There's nothing you could spend $1 trillion on. I mean, I guess you could buy the Cleveland Browns 1,000 times over. Are they worth $1 billion? Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if you want the Cleveland Browns 1,000 times over. But yeah, right. I mean, there's no way that money could be spent. Nobody can have $1 trillion worth of entertainment or joy. In many ways, it escapes our comprehension, right? And I guess I can only add to that by repeating Plato's thoughts about this, right? I mean, maybe Musk might be thinking, well, $1 trillion is going to make me happy, right? But in fact, I don't know if people saw this. He tweeted out or X'd out, I don't know what we call it now, but he posted a social media message shortly before he acquired $1 trillion or passed the $1 trillion threshold, saying, "My next goal is $10 trillion," right? Which is the perfect example of the pleonexia I was talking about earlier, right? If you can't be happy with $1 trillion, you could never be happy, right? Money can't buy happiness, right? According to ancient Greek wisdom. And I think there's a lot to this, right? And there's nothing he could spend that money on, I think, that would make him happy, right? And this is why I like the language of the ancient philosophers, because I think in a real sense, this is a really diseased soul, right? To think that somehow he's doing, if I only finally get $10 trillion, then I'll finally be happy, right? If he gets there, I guarantee you he will move the bar again, and he'll find a reason for being dissatisfied because this is the way he's wired. Yeah. Yeah. Can you talk about how, love thy neighbor is a lot easier to do when it's 25,000? Yeah. Yeah. Population affected the increase in inequality and how it challenges the efforts to combat inequality? Yeah, that's a great question, right? Especially when I'm talking about these ancient societies like, Nazareth and Athens and Sparta. Yeah, they're way smaller than the United States of America, right? They're way smaller than Ohio, right? They're way smaller than Cleveland. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, thank you. The question was, the old philosophers are talking about very small communities. And it seems a lot easier to build friendship in a smaller community and social harmony in a small community as opposed to a large one, right? It's a really good question. So the United States of America, what's our population now? 320 million, roughly? Yeah. Yeah, right, that's a lot bigger than 25,000 people in ancient Athens, right? There's one person in my book that I haven't talked about yet, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who takes up this question when he's writing a proposed constitution for Poland. And he says, look, the problem with Poland is it's too big, right? And it still is a big country for European countries, right? When Rousseau talked about inequality, he was thinking about the city of Geneva, where he was born and raised. city coincidentally about the size of 25,000. It's bigger now, but still quite a bit smaller than Poland. And he says, yeah, this is a real conundrum. You know, I want to help the Polish, but maybe they're just too big to actually solve these problems. And then he arrives at a solution, and it's a solution that will be familiar to Americans. And the solution is federalism. He says, look, we can still maintain the Polish nation, but we need to break it up into smaller units that will be the fundamental social and political units for most practical purposes, right? So that you will feel, first, a connection to your community, much smaller than the nation of Poland, right? And then the Polish nation exists to collaborate where collaboration is necessary, right? This is actually not far off from what the anti-federalists proposed that I mentioned a while ago. They wanted the states to be the fundamental political units in the United States, right? And we still have states, of course, right? And, you know, we have communities and so forth, right? But I suppose the real point of Rousseau is to take federalism more seriously than we do, such that the election of our mayor should be more important to us than the election of the president of the United States, right? So that's at least one solution drawn from my book, right, that at least addresses this issue, right? But it's a big problem, right? And it's, as we've learned, especially in the 21st century, it's really hard to get Americans in, you know, the urban north getting along with those in the rural south, right? In many ways, people don't feel like they're part of the same country at all, right? They have different religions and traditions and practices, and connecting can feel difficult at times. So, yeah, thank you.
We are getting what is the role of campaign financing in advancing the
Yeah.
equality,
Yeah.
and what could be done about it? And then just in general, you studied a lot of cultures of different eras. What are the 2 or 3 techniques, if you haven't said them already, that actually have had some success in closing this gap in stabilizing?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So the questions were about campaign finance rules, and then secondly about what techniques, if any, have proved effective in addressing inequality. So campaign finance rules, of course, right? We tried that. we had the McCain-Feingold law, campaign finance law, which placed some serious limits on the amount of money people could spend on campaigns and elections. Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional, that it inhibited free speech in this country, and things have never really been the same since, right? And if we return to our old friend Elon Musk again, I believe he spent about $250 million on the last election, right? Which is, of course, pocket change for a trillionaire, right? He probably found that in his couch, right between the cushions. So, yes, of course, campaign finance is a huge issue, right? And if I were running for office, and I am definitely not, nor will I ever, right? But if I wanted to be serious about doing something about inequality, this would be at the very top of my agenda, right? Is that the Constitution will have to be amended to allow real caps on campaign contributions, to reintroduce some sanity into this, because the absence of those regulations has given our republic all the appearances of being an oligarchy, which is absolutely unacceptable, right? I think, at least. Secondly, the question about what of these things have worked. Well, if I'm to quote my friend Walter Scheidel again, the only thing that works is plagues, natural disasters, state failure, revolution, right? That's according to Walter. I don't know if I'm quite as pessimistic as Walter. Walter spends a lot of time talking about how great the Black Plague was for reintroducing equality. Look, I think I'm going to side with John Stuart Mill once again, who said, look, maybe the laws of how money is made in some way parallel the laws of nature or the scientific laws, right? The laws of profit, happens according to certain, rules about supply and demand and so forth. But then Mill adds, but the way we distribute that money is entirely up to us, right? We don't have to give all that money to a few people, right? So if the people demand some sanity on this issue, there's any number of things that they could do, right? Which of these have worked historically, right? Well, as I mentioned before, the 91% tax rate on the wealthiest Americans worked pretty well, in fact, right? It really did rein in inequality. I'll give a simple number here to explain this. In 1965, when the income tax on the wealthiest Americans was still 90, it might have been 70% at this point, but quite high on the wealthiest Americans. The pay ratio from the CEO to the average employee at the same company was about 30-1, which is a big gap. It's much more than Plato wants, right? But after that was, after the 1980, after the election of Ronald Reagan and the institution of a new economic regime, which should say includes the recently deceased Alan Greenspan, right? And after income taxes on the wealthiest Americans were reduced from, at that point, 70% to 28% in Reagan's first tax bill, CEO pay went to over 300-1, right? CEOs were now paid 300 times, as they are now, paid 300 times more than the average employee at the same company, right? Right, so what did they do with that money before, right? I mean, companies still made money back, in this time. They didn't pay it out to the CEOs the way they do today. What did they do with that money? Well, instead of giving it to the CEO, they gave pensions to their employees, generous health care plans, right? I mean, those of you who are old enough to remember, they used to pay for the college education of their employees' children, right? Not all of them, but many of them, right? They found creative ways of spreading that money around that created a lot more equality than we have today. So certainly higher taxes, right? Higher inheritance taxes would be very helpful, something that John Stuart Mill talks about, and certainly have been higher than, they used to be much higher than they are right now. I think if you're inheriting money, what's the threshold? I think you have to inherit, the inheritance has to be over $20 million before you have to pay any taxes on inheritance, right? So you have to be extremely wealthy, you need to pay anything in inheritance taxes. So yes, these are some things, and I should say, I haven't emphasized this enough. I did talk about it a little bit. One consistent theme that comes up in my chapters and all these thinkers I address, and something that all of them are pretty enthusiastic about and I think would be helpful is more emphasis in education on shaming excessive wealth, shaming excessive selfishness, right? Shaming greed, right? Teaching children, right, that maybe Elon Musk isn't a role model. Maybe there are better role models out there that are more worth mirroring in yourself. So educational reforms is, again, a consistent theme in this book, starting with Plato, but all the way through the 19th century. They all talk about the importance of education as a way of trying to address inequality in the long run.
In some ways, I think what you've been saying touches on this. So I don't know, maybe it's not as relevant as it was a few minutes ago. But kind of when it was brought up, is there any meaning to be a trillionaire? It occurred to me, I think it's perhaps less about wealth and more about power, and $1 trillion is an incredible capacity to shape thought.
Yeah.
In today's world. I wonder a little bit with some of these philosophers if there almost was a presumption that there was kind of a goodwill of searching and reason would be universally respected, whereas now I think we have this capacity to just promote an answer apart from thought.
Yeah.
And I just wonder though kind of in this very different world, if any of these philosophers in your mind offer something to that reality where there is just this overwhelming capacity, like we can talk about unionizing, but they can get an algorithm to turn, millions of people against unions or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So I don't know, if any of the philosophers say anything that maybe speaks to that capacity.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you didn't hear it, right, the question was a concern about how being extremely wealthy today gives billionaires the opportunity to shape public thought and to create a significant portion of the population that's willing to follow the billionaire anywhere, right? To accept what they say as true, regardless of the billionaire's reasoning ability and moral commitments. So yeah, I think this is where we can say technology has really ramped up some of the effects of inequality in a way that probably wasn't fully appreciated by the folks I write about. Right? Elon Musk, he keeps coming up. He's the richest man in the world. We're going to have to talk about him. Bought Twitter on a lark, right? Because who doesn't have a spare $50 billion to spend on a social media company, right? And he uses this to amplify his views, many of which I personally find racist and disturbing, borderline on Nazi views, frankly, which I find this all deeply distressing, right? And he's used this technology not only for him to say things like this, but to amplify the voices of people who are outspoken Nazis, people like Richard Spence, right? And what's his name? Nick Fuentes, right? Technology makes everything worse in this regard. There are good uses of technology, but this is a particularly concerning one. And I don't know that the folks I write about have a lot of wisdom to offer on this. I mean, although maybe they should have, right? Because the printing press offered this opportunity to rich people in modernity in a way that they didn't have access to before, right? A rich person could print a pamphlet and argue ridiculous things and get people to buy into them, right? It's something that rich people could have done and probably did do. So, you know, probably the closest who gets to this of the people I talk about is Thomas Hobbes. Again, Thomas Hobbes has some very specific problems with rich people, and one of those problems, he says, and this is maybe relevant when we think about Elon Musk here, especially when Elon Musk, you know, began his political activities during the Biden administration. For Thomas Hobbes, rich people at a certain point can rival and even supersede the authority of the government, right? They can become so powerful and admired that they can rival the sovereign, the government, what Hobbes calls the Leviathan. And when that happens, you run a real risk of state collapse, right? You have two competing authorities for power, right? And this is part of what led to the English Civil War, when both Parliament and the king were claiming to be sovereign at the same time. This is a longer story than that, but there were rich people involved in this who basically owned Parliament and instigated the English Civil War. So I suppose Thomas Hobbes is probably the best answer to that question for somebody who thought about that. But I don't think even Thomas Hobbes could have imagined, you know, social media and it instantaneously available. You know, that technology would make the thoughts of the richest people in the world instantaneously available and seductive to the whole world all at the same time. It's almost as overwhelming as Musk's fortune itself.
We have time for two more questions. So,
Okay. Two more questions, Bob says. Yeah.
Dwayne's getting the last question.
Okay.
So in 2011, Wilson and Pickett published a book.
The spirit level. Yes, of course.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's about the social cost of inequality. And has new research come out, you know, sort of consistently supporting that I should use it now?
So they did publish a subsequent book as well, Wilkinson and Pickett, and I forget the title. Yeah. But is there? Yes, there's constant. I'll say one of the best things about living today as a scholar and working on this is that there's new research coming out all the time. A lot of it is social science, like in nature, like the spirit level, which you referenced. There's this. I'm more inclined to humanities-oriented studies. That's my background, which is why I cited Walter Scheidel, an historian. Guido Alfani is an historian at Bocconi University in Milan, wrote a brilliant book about the history of rich people called As Gods Among Men. Darren McMahon at Dartmouth University wrote a brilliant book about the history of equality called Equality, the History of an Elusive Idea. These are, one more, Branko Milanovic, an economist at CUNY in New York, wrote an excellent book called Visions of Inequality, where he talks about economists over history, really since the French Revolution, as they addressed inequality. I'm talking all about books that address historical inequality. That's not really what the spirit level does. This is my area of expertise. If you're looking for contemporary research on this, I would say certainly Martin Gilens as a political scientist who works on issues of oligarchy. Ben Page, also a political scientist. He's at Northwestern University. He actually wrote a pretty well-known article. He got on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart talking about this. He wrote a very important article arguing that the United States is in fact technically no longer a democracy but an oligarchy because our legislature now takes its cues from the moneyed class and not from the people anymore, right? So Benjamin Page is very important, but there's a ton of great social science research out there. There's a sociologist by the name of Rachel Sherman, wrote a book called Uneasy Street. Do you know this one? Yeah, where she interviews wealthy New Yorkers and talks with them. Another terrific book written by Daniel Markovits at Yale Law School. The title is slipping my memory right now, but it's about the dangers of meritocracy, specifically in the context of an unequal society. He talks about how damaging meritocratic norms are. And this is also something I talk about in my book, as we didn't talk about it tonight. But he talks about how the culture of meritocracy has been, to some degree, created by inequality, but has also fueled much more extensive inequality, and has also created this kind of pathological culture where every high school student feels like they have to take 20 AP classes because that's the only way they can get into Harvard, and Harvard is the only way they can become, they can get $100 million, right, and become someone rich and important, right, and it creates all these pathological drives and children are sacrificing friendships and relationships and, art and other things that they should be doing when they're young because society tells them they're not worth anything unless they're a millionaire or a billionaire or a trillionaire, right? So Daniel Markovits, I'll think of the title later, I'm sure, but he wrote an excellent book about this. Michael Sandel at Harvard University wrote a book on very similar themes as well. That one is called The Tyranny of Meritocracy. I remember that title. So yes, it's not a great time to live in terms of wealth distribution, but it's a great time to live in terms of having access to really good research on inequality. It's not really a great upside when I think about it. I would easily trade it, but at least people are talking about it, right? This actually reminds me of an important thing in Plato, right? So one thing I didn't talk about with Plato, Plato was, according to historical legend, we don't really know if these stories are true or not, but according to the historians, Plutarch I mentioned before, and also Diogenes Laertius, an ancient Greek historian, it's reported that Plato twice had the opportunity to be a lawgiver, the same way Lycurgus and Solon were for Athens and Sparta, for other cities. And he went to go visit these cities to see what they were like and what kind of laws they needed. And the legend is when he returned back to Athens, he said, you know what? I can't write laws for either of these cities because they have too much inequality. They're already too far gone, right? It's just hopeless. Just let them fall apart, and maybe after they fall apart, we can start over. But the upshot of this is Plato didn't give up. What Plato did was he went back, he founded the Academy, the first university of the West, and said, we're going to study this stuff here, and we're going to talk about this, right? And we're going to figure out ways to address these problems so that when we actually can address them, we'll have things to say. That's the upside of a fairly bleak situation in Plato. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This historical analysis of wealth inequality, seemed to
Yeah.
and to be part of a movement that might be unraveling new ideas, gift economy, some forms of mutual exchange. Are you aware of these small cells of hope?
Oh, yeah.
And if you were to kind of be the pastor here,
Yeah.
and coax us in a certain direction, to consider
Yeah.
certain kind of ways of being in relationship with those who are suffering in this way.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So the question was, where are the rays of hope, right? Where are the communities that maybe we can connect with that might be similarly concerned about inequality? And so let me share an anecdote. So some of you might know, I think maybe the community shared the fact that I published an op-ed in the New York Times last weekend about Elon Musk becoming a trillionaire. And I can confess to you, my wife really did not want me to publish this because she was terrified that Musk would tweet this out and we would be harassed and doxxed and, goodness knows what, right? This piece has been out now for 4 days. I have not received a single piece of hate mail, not a single stray angry voicemail, not a hint of any of that. I've gotten a lot of responses, and they have all been extremely positive, right? I think there's a lot. I think a lot more people are concerned about this than some of our leaders might lead us to believe, right? And certainly than Elon Musk wants us to believe, right? I think in some ways it's all fairly intuitive, right? I spend a lot of time talking about what philosophers say about this stuff, right? But for a lot of people, this is just intuitive fairness, right? So I do hold out a lot of hope that there's a real will to fix this. Not that there aren't very interested parties that want nothing of the sort, right? How do we connect with these people, right? I mean, one way to connect with these people, right? I mean, I found in my experience was to publish an op-ed, right? But, that was the New York Times. That was great, and it had national reach. But even just, writing letters to the local newspaper, right? You get your name out there. People are going to reach out to you and say, "Hey, I saw that. I totally agree with you. We ought to do something about that," right? I think certainly going to protests, right, and talking to people who are similarly concerned, right? There are a lot of people concerned about these problems, and not just regionally, not just in the north. There are people in the south and the west who are every bit as concerned about this as people in the north and in the Midwest. I think there's a large contingency of people who would like to see something done about all of this, and I think the more we put ourselves out there, the more we'll find others very eager to connect with us.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks all the questioners for their thoughtful questions. I think we've touched on a number of topics that maybe can be visited again in future sessions here at CSP. And remember to perhaps tell your friends that when they consider who to vote for, are they voting for someone who wants to enable inequality or reform inequality? Thank you.